Hi, it's Ann Maxwell, and I am talking today about a behavior contract, or these are also called a contract for behavior change. And we're going to talk about why these can be helpful and when they can be used and how they can be used. So let's first acknowledge that for some people, and as a clinician I see this, when I bring up the idea of writing a contract for behavior change, I think for some parents it can either sound like it's an extreme measure, like, oh, are things really that bad for us? Or for some people who are dealing with really challenging behaviors with their child, it might feel like it's a last resort. But I like to think of it as a positive strategy that we can use to promote appropriate adaptive behaviors for our child, and the trickle down is that it helps the whole family. And in fact, sometimes what we do is we write or we encourage the writing of contracts not just for the particular child that is prompting us to write it, but for the entire family. So it can be used proactively, which means that we're thinking ahead, oh, there may be some issues, and there may be some issues coming up as our child is learning how to drive, or when our child gets his first cell phone. We might be proactive and prepare a contract before behaviors happen, or it's also used reactively, which means that we didn't anticipate that there would be problems or didn't quite plan for it, and now we're dealing with some issues and realizing we need a contract. We need to work on a contract. Either way is acceptable. It can be used, as I said, proactively or reactively, and it should include, the contract should include sections that very descriptively, explicitly state the expectations and responsibilities for whomever the contract is written for, and what the consequences are. So let's talk about why we might need it. Well, when our kids are really young, the rules are for the most part, they're kind of black and white. They're pretty clear. Don't touch the stove. Don't step in the street. Don't hit your brother. So as the kid gets older, though, things get more complicated, and we start talking about constructs like showing respect for each other, or taking responsibility for our actions, or showing independence in doing your homework or doing chores, or showing proper manners with people. So things get a little bit more complicated, and we also can't predict every situation our child is going to get into, and we can't make a specific rule for everything that might happen, and that's where the contract can really help. So we can talk about contracts. We said before that they can be proactive and reactive, and they can also be very specific or very general. So if we're talking about a general contract, then that might be like the premise is that we're contracting with our child for him or her to show respect to family members. Okay, that's great. That's a good reason to write a contract. It's going to be important, though, to define what we mean by respect. So what is that going to look like? And that's important, especially if you've got a child who's going to be like pushing the limits a little bit, like, well, I don't know what you mean by respect. I thought I was showing respect. So we want to define it. We want to be specific and help our child understand what it is that we're looking for when we say respect. So we can also talk about another type of contract, which is more specific or event-based. So if our child is learning how to drive, that's a good time for a contract on using your parents' car. What are the expectations? Are you going to keep are you going to pay for your own gas? Are you going to keep the car clean? Are you going to always ask permission first? What are the things that are important to the family in terms of allowing the child to use the car? So those are some examples of contracts that we can make. And again, it's really important that the expectations and the responsibilities be laid out specifically, and that the consequences are also laid out. So that's an equally important part of the contract. If one of the expectations or rules, if you will, is broken, what happens? What happens if the child doesn't ask permission to use the car? Well, maybe he loses the privilege of using it for a week. So there are the expectations in the contract, and then of equal importance, there are the consequences. And it's best if you can write it with the child, so the child feels like he or she has some say and some agency in it. Now, if you have a child that's absolutely refusing to participate, then draft it yourself. But to the extent that you can enlist the child to participate, it's going to be more helpful if they feel like they have had some say in part of it. And it's also important in the contract to have a review date. A date when the family can come together and review the contract, and not just the child's progress with it, but the contract itself. Like, does it still feel fair? Does it feel like we need to adjust it, or are the consequences too harsh? Should we lighten up on the consequences, or conversely, do we need harder consequences? Are the expectations clear enough? So that those renewal or review and renewal dates are important. And I often suggest that the family convene every 30 days to review and adapt and renegotiate the contract. Then it's also important to sign it and to have the child sign it. It's a contract. You're making an agreement, so you're signing it and you're asking the child to sign it. And then lastly, it's important to enforce it. It's only going to work if we use it. It's only going to work if we're enforcing it. And some parents actually come back and report to me that they find that their child gets less upset with them because it's out there in an explicit contract. It feels less like the parent saying, you know, you broke this rule, there's this consequence. It's in a contract, so it's maybe it takes some of the emotion out of it. And speaking of emotion, when the child does, and I don't say if, I say when, because there is really likely to be some pushback against the contract, especially with teenagers. So when things are when rules are broken or challenged at some point, as a parent, we don't want to get angry. We want to just refer to the contract. Oh, well, let's look at our contract. Okay, well, that looks like that was this particular rule that wasn't observed. This rule was broken. So what does it say on our contract? Oh, it says there's this consequence. So I hope that was helpful, and we will be putting some examples of contracts on our website, contracts for young children and for tweens and for teenagers. So you can check those out, and hopefully those will be helpful for you. Thanks.